question on a different subject. Phil Hamilton's conviction the other day. I'm curious about two things. One is, if you think that would cause the sitting legislature to change anything or do anything differently, or create new policies or laws or whatever. And the second question is, there was an article, op-ed in the Times-Dispatch the other day when they were talking about his being broke, and then they took that on and talked about the very low salaries of legislators. Do you feel that there's a connection there, and could we actually pay legislators more in Virginia, or do you think that they're stuck at that wage forever?
They're part-time legislators, so they're getting paid what they're getting paid for. I mean, I know it's not just 2 months of work, but that's about what they're in session for. Phil was broke not because he wasn't getting paid enough as a legislator. Phil was broke because he spent too much money. It wasn't like free color. I'll let Christina's from that area.
And also, people and the delegates will tell you that they make $15,000, but they also get the office allowance. So we are actually into the 30s. But yes, they would argue that this is really a full-time job, and that's true. They don't cut that off when they come home. They are still working with their constituents. I think there is an argument for making them full-time or having a longer session and paying them more. But I think there's also a value in having people who can still have a job and still be part of that community. I'm not, Congress is full-time and they are paid more. Do we get more out of them than our state legislature? I don't know. I'm still, I've spent most of my life in Virginia, so I'm always, a little hesitant to embrace huge change, so I'm not quite ready for that yet.
I think Christina brings up a good point, though, the discussion of sort of lengthening the session and paying them more. That has been sort of something that's come up recently. You're hearing legislators say we just don't have enough time to tackle this complicated issue in a very short 45-day session. I heard that this session a lot on some state pension fund changes. There were some changes to the sex offender program, violent sex offender program, that the legislature sort of said, let's take a year and study this and come back because we just don't have the time to do it now. And so I think, I sort of predicted, I think you will at least hear sort of a growing chorus of people talking about that idea. I think it's going to be hard to convince sort of the public writ large to pay their politicians more. I think that's where the challenge is that, yes, they do work 12 months out of the year. It is, although our legislators love to embrace the idea that they are part-time legislators, they shout that from the rafters, but it's a full-time job, but I think sort of the reality of convincing voters to support that idea would be pretty tough.
I think in answer to your other question, I think Christina's paper, a reporter did a story just the other day in which not one person, including the governor or the Speaker of the House, had anything definitive to say after the conviction that said, oh yeah, we should do anything different. Maybe they'll surprise us and do something in the 2012 session, but after Phil Hamilton was, I can't remember now what time period this was. I think he had been indicted. I don't know. Maybe he was under investigation. Something clearly was going on, but he clearly had not been convicted yet. There was a slew of bills that were put in about ethics. That was clearly the time where it was on people's mind. There were so many bills that were put in. Most of them didn't get anywhere. They were weakened. That was the time that I thought that the legislature, if they were going to do anything, they were going to do it. And of those that passed, and there were a good number that passed, none of them would have prevented what happened with Phil Hamilton from happening again. So, you could argue now he's been convicted, they might come back and really prevent something like this from happening. My guess would be that they will not. You know, the time, the effort would have probably been before, because that was when it was really happening. I mean, it's just a guess. They could surprise me and come back and do it, but you know, that's going to be months from now. It's going to be half a year from now. I mean, are they going to have the wherewithal to want to do it then? I doubt it.
I could jump in and go back to what Adam was saying about the part-time legislature and the idea of extending legislature. I think what you're more likely to see instead of a longer session is increased limits on bills that legislators can file. Because even though they know they're coming down there for just 45 days, they put in 2,000 bills. I mean, so if they would restrain themselves more,
They
they
already
might
have
have
a
more.
restriction now.
I know they do,
15
but
bills.
still, there's a ton.
The Senate does it, just the House, right?
Right.
Yeah.
We have a distinguished member of the House of Delegates in the House, and I think we should afford him the opportunity of the rare chance to publicly ask a question of the people who usually publicly question him.
Well, I think I've asked this question to this group before, but of all of the things that happened in the General Assembly this session, what do you think the biggest thing that happened that people didn't know about?
Didn't know about before we told them?
That you never really wrote, you know, looking back over it, this is a story that you all missed. You all do miss stories occasionally, don't you?
Yeah, sure we
But
do.
if we did, we would know.
Right, exactly. But how would we know it now? But we sure do.
Tell us.
Well, then you tell me what was the biggest story of the session.
Aside from redistricting.
I mean, I think the biggest issue, and I think it's one that's still hanging out there, is the issue with state employee compensation, the state pension fund. I think it is certainly one that we all covered ad nauseum. I mean, I cannot tell you how many stories I wrote about changes to the Virginia retirement system. But the fact of the matter is, it's a complicated, I mean, as you well know, it's just a complicated, confusing issue, especially to maybe the state employees on the younger end of the employment line who are not thinking about retirement. It's hard for somebody who's my age to start thinking about what the state's going to do for me when I'm ready to retire. And so, as I said before, the legislature sort of punted on that for the year, and they're going to talk about it and come back and see whether they're made some changes next year. I think that was, in terms of just impact of people, I think that was probably one of the biggest stories of the session, especially once ABC died.
I mean, I know that after session there were some things that I remember hearing about, thinking I should have written about that, and there's somewhere I kept a little list, and I'll probably find it right before next session. Like I said, there's 2,000 bills, and none of us can cover everything. And obviously we all try, there was one day I wrote 8 stories during this past session, and I'm the only one from my organization that covers it, so I do a lot, and they all do a lot, but some papers like the TV's got like 4 or 5 people wandering around. So yeah, I mean, yes, of course there are stories that we miss, and I would love for you to tell me when I'm missing one, because it's a good story. I want to write about it.
The mandate from the previous election seemed to be jobs in the economy. Was jobs in the economy an issue that generated a significant change in the state budget, which is always the biggest story? Without being a story, the state budget is the document that is the most important bill.
Well, the governor has, for the last couple of years, put in a series of economic development initiatives. It's always a little hard to say how much of an effect they actually have, because many times a corporation has already decided they're going to come to Virginia, but they'll, play a couple of states off each other just to see what else they might be able to get. Every governor always claims credit for every single new job that is created during his term, and that's their prerogative as the governor. Whether actually, the national economy is improving, and so McDonald gets some credit. He's certainly not screwing up for Virginia. Virginia is improving, and as is typical for Virginia, is a little bit ahead of the curve. A lot of he he struggled with some of his economic development proposals because he didn't have very strong performance measures, and even the Republicans in the House were pushing back and saying, if you want this passed, you're going to have to be more clear about, you know, how this money is going to be used and how you're going to determine who gets the money. So there was a little pushing back and forth. You know, for McDonald, what it really does is it keeps him in the news talking about jobs and doing something, whether you could really draw a line from those little initiatives to the results, maybe unclear, but he is presenting himself as the jobs governor, as the governor who is focused, that's his number one priority. So from a political standpoint, it is very smart. But Virginia, you know, still doesn't do the big, huge economic incentive packages that some other states do. So we're still pretty modest in terms of what we do. And because we're near DC, we don't really have to do some of those huge packages to get a big corporation to come here. So, you know, a little bit of tinkering around the edges is probably enough.
Along those lines, the governor for the past 10 days has been in China, today Seoul, Korea, Japan last week. Is there anything newsworthy coming out of that trip?
He announced that he would announce 6 memorandum of understanding, so 6 agreements with some companies coming up, but as businesses go, I guess you can't announce them all because they're still confidential. I don't know, he announced a few things with some companies, limited agreements with some companies that they would, at those different countries, would take some more goods from Virginia, I think tobacco and wine, and I don't remember what else, pork, chicken, things like that. But I guess most of those agreements are going to be coming out over the next few months. What else did he announce? A major, the art thing was probably the most interesting thing. The Virginia Museum of Fine Arts in Richmond, there's going to be a 4-year agreement with the museum in China. And I don't know what else he announced.
I think Christina hit the nail on the head. The fact of this trip and with sort of job creation in general is it's hard to say immediately what happens with all of this because, you know, with this trip, it's going to take a little while before they start sort of dropping out the breadcrumbs from what happened. And with some of these incentives, it'll be a decade from now before we really have a sense of, was this a prudent investment? Did it pay off? Did Virginia get what it paid for?
Right.
And so that's the challenge, and I think Christina was exactly right, that the legislature sort of grappled with that this session, that there wasn't much in the way of sort of a metric to be able to say, we did this, and we got this, and this is why we should do it again. And that, I think, is going to continue to be a problem for the governor.
But again, that's not this governor. That's
right.
Governor Kane, Governor Warner, every governor.
Right, yeah, exactly. That's it.
They all went on trade missions, and they all
Exactly.
spent money, and they all hoped that it would turn out